This week, we are moving into chapter 3, where we begin looking at aging from a more postmodern perspective. We have already spent several weeks thinking about aging as a social construction, age inequality, ageism, risk, work, retirement, and care. This week, we are going to build on those ideas by asking a slightly different question. How do we come to understand ourselves and other people as old? That might sound like a simple question, but it actually brings us into some really interesting sociological territory. Chapter 3 asks us to think about aging in terms of identity, the body, culture, representation, and the ways that meanings of aging are created and negotiated in everyday life. Rather than assuming that there is one universal experience of growing older, a postmodern perspective encourages us to pay attention to the different meanings people attach to aging and to the ways those meanings can change over time. Think back to where we started this course. We said that aging is biological, but the meaning we attach to aging is social. This week, we are taking that idea even further. Our bodies change as we age, but we do not simply experience those changes in isolation. We interpret them through cultural ideas about what an older body is supposed to look like, how an older person is supposed to behave, and what older adults are supposedly capable of doing. This is where our first supplemental reading, James Thornton's Myths of Aging or Ageist Stereotypes, fits particularly well with chapter 3. Thornton is interested in the stories and assumptions that society creates about aging. He argues that we frequently use simplified images and labels to describe older adults, and those images can become so familiar that they begin to look like common sense. Think about some of the labels we use when talking about older people. We might imagine the frail older adult who needs constant assistance. We might imagine the wealthy retiree traveling the world. We might imagine the technologically confused older person who needs a younger family member to fix their computer. Or we might imagine the energetic, young at heart, older adult who exercises every day and refuses to act their age. These images may seem very different from one another, but they have something important in common. They reduce an enormously diverse population to a particular story about what aging is supposed to look like. Thornton argues that even apparently positive stereotypes can still be ageist because they create expectations about what older people should be like. For example, telling people that older adults are naturally wise and calm might sound positive. But what happens when an older person does not fit that image? What happens when an older person is angry, ambitious, adventurous, sexually active, politically outspoken, technologically sophisticated, or simply uninterested in being the stereotype of a wise older person? The problem with stereotypes is not only that they can be negative, the problem is that they simplify people. Thornton also makes an important connection between stereotypes and social institutions. Myths about aging can become embedded in organizational cultures, policies, procedures, and everyday practices. They can influence areas such as healthcare, employment, education, and retirement. This connects directly to what we discussed earlier in the course about ageism. Ageism is not simply one person saying something offensive about an older adult. Ageist assumptions can become part of the way institutions operate. And once those assumptions become institutionalized, they can influence people's actual opportunities. Thornton also introduces the idea of structural lag. Structural lag occurs when social institutions do not adapt quickly enough to changes in the population. In the context of aging, this can happen when people are living longer and healthier lives, but social institutions continue to operate according to outdated assumptions about what older adults are capable of or what roles they should occupy. This is an important idea because our society is changing. People are living longer, people are working longer, people are changing careers later in life, people are forming families at different ages, people are using technology throughout the life course, and yet some of our ideas about what it means to be old remain remarkably traditional. That creates a mismatch between people's actual lives and the social categories we use to describe them. This brings us to the second supplemental reading for this week, Understanding Changes and Stability in the Long-Term Use of Technologies by Seniors Who Are Aging in Place. At first glance, this might seem like a completely different topic. What does technology have to do with postmodern aging? Actually, quite a lot. Technology gives us a very concrete example of how our assumptions about older adults can be challenged. There is a common stereotype that older adults simply do not understand or use technology. You have probably heard some version of this idea. Older people aren't good with computers. They don't understand smartphones. They don't want to learn new technology. But the researchers in this study found something much more complicated. They followed older adults living independently in their homes over time and examined how their use of technology changed. This was a longitudinal qualitative study, meaning that researchers returned to participants over multiple points in time rather than simply asking them about technology use once. And what they found is that technology use among older adults is dynamic. Sometimes technology use remains stable, sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases, and sometimes a person's relationship with a particular technology changes completely. The researchers developed what they call the DITUS framework, which stands for Dynamics in Technology Use by Seniors. The framework identifies several factors that influence technology use, including emotional attachment, whether the technology meets a person's needs, cues that encourage use, proficiency, resources, and social support. The researchers also identified events that can disrupt a person's established pattern of technology use, including changes in health, finances, social relationships, physical environments, personal goals, and available alternatives. This is sociologically interesting because it challenges the idea that technology use is simply a matter of age. Instead, technology use is connected to people's circumstances. Imagine an older person who rarely uses a smartphone. We could look at that and say older people don't like technology. But what if they have never needed one? What if they have a landline? What if their friends live nearby? What if they do not have reliable internet access? What if they have difficulty seeing the screen? What if someone gives them a smartphone and teaches them how to use it? Suddenly, the question changes. Instead of asking whether older people are technologically capable, we can ask what circumstances make technology useful, accessible, and meaningful. The researchers actually found examples of older adults increasing their technology use because of changes in their social relationships. In one case, support from family members helped an older participant become comfortable with a mobile phone and eventually a tablet. In another case, a change in family circumstances meant that a participant had to rely more heavily on a microwave for preparing meals. In other words, technology became part of people's lives because their lives changed. This is a really important point. Technology does not exist separately from society. Our relationships influence how we use technology. Our health influences how we use technology. Our finances influence what technology we can access. Our homes influence what technology is practical, and our needs and goals influence whether technology has any value to us. The researchers conclude that aging and technology use are both complex, dynamic, and personal. They argue that technological solutions designed to support aging in place need to be able to adapt to changes in people's lives rather than assuming that people's needs remain constant. And that idea brings us right back to chapter 3. Postmodern perspectives encourage us to question fixed categories. Instead of saying, older people are this way, we can ask, how is this person experiencing aging within this particular social and cultural context? Instead of saying, older people don't use technology, we can ask, what influences this person's relationship with technology? Instead of saying older people are dependent, we can ask what social conditions create or reduce dependency. And instead of asking whether someone is successfully performing the role of an older person, we can ask who created the expectations surrounding that role in the first place. This is one of the most important shifts in perspective we are making in this course. We are moving away from thinking about older adults as a category with a predetermined set of characteristics. Instead, we are thinking about aging as something dynamic. People change, bodies change, relationships change, technologies change, institutions change, and people's identities can change as well. This does not mean that age no longer matters. Age clearly matters, but it means that chronological age alone cannot tell us everything we need to know about a person. Two people can be the same age and have completely different identities, relationships, resources, interests, abilities, and experiences. And even the same person can experience their own aging differently at different points in their life. That is why I want you to pay attention to the idea of identity this week. We don't simply have an age. We have ideas about what our age means. We also have ideas about what other people's ages mean. Those ideas are influenced by culture, media, institutions, relationships, and our own experiences. And sometimes those ideas can become so familiar that we stop recognizing them as assumptions. That is exactly what Thornton is asking us to notice when he talks about myths and stereotypes. And it is exactly what the technology study demonstrates when it shows us that older adults' behavior does not necessarily match the stereotypes we have created about them. So let's bring all three readings together. Chapter 3 asks us to think about aging, identity, bodies, culture, and changing meanings. Thornton asks us to question the myths and stereotypes that simplify our understanding of older adults. And the technology study gives us an example of how much more complicated older adults' lives actually are when we look at them over time. Together, they remind us that aging is not a single experience. It is dynamic, it is personal, it is social, and it takes place within a constantly changing environment. As you work through this week's readings, I want you to pay attention to the assumptions you encounter about what older adults are supposedly like. When you hear that older people are resistant to change, ask yourself where that idea comes from. When you hear that older adults cannot learn new technology, ask what circumstances might actually influence technology use. When you see an advertisement or television show portraying an older person in a particular way, ask what assumptions about aging are being communicated. And perhaps most importantly, ask yourself whether the image you are seeing describes a real person or whether it is another social story about what aging is supposed to look like. That is one of the central questions of sociology. We don't simply accept the categories society gives us. We examine them, we question them, and we ask how those categories shape people's lives. This week, I want you to start thinking about aging not as a fixed identity, but as a changing experience that unfolds within a social world that is constantly changing too.